Good evening and welcome to the JFK Junior Forum at the Institute of Politics at the Harvard Kennedy School. We are delighted to welcome you here for our first forum of this spring semester, where we look at the question assessing the first year of the Biden-Harris administration. So we warmly welcome you here on this very busy news day, where we've put together a dazzling panel of 4 experienced journalists who will provide their perspective from the perspective of having covered White Houses, Congress, domestic, foreign policy, politics, and they'll bring all that perspective to share in a conversation and then questions from our students and those in the audience. So we warmly welcome here. We're off to a great start here this semester at the Institute of Politics, and certainly the forum will be an active and vital place for conversations going forward. So my name is Mark Gear, and I'm the director of the Institute of Politics, and I'm delighted to welcome our 4 distinguished journalists. I'll introduce them briefly, then hand it off to them for their conversation. First, we welcome Dan Balz, who is the chief correspondent of the Washington Post, and we're fortunate he's also a senior fellow here at the Institute of Politics. For many decades, he's been at the Post covering 10 presidential campaigns and is an astute observer of today's politics and administrations, author of several best-selling books, and he will bring his perspective to this panel in his effective way. We welcome Abby Phillip to our forum this evening, a graduate of the college and a member of the Institute of Politics Senior Advisory Committee. She is a senior White House had been a correspondent at CNN covering the Trump administration. And she is a senior correspondent for CNN and the host of Inside Politics on Sunday. She has covered, as I said, the Trump administration, anchored election night coverage, and she will bring her perspective, having been a White House correspondent and an astute observer of politics. So we warmly welcome Abby back to Harvard. Abby, welcome, welcome, welcome. Kelly O'Donnell, of course, joins us as well as senior White House correspondent for NBC News, where she contributes across the NBC News platforms. She has covered administrations from the Biden, Trump, Obama, Bush administrations, as well as Capitol Hill. So her perspective will be a very important one, having had the depth of experience from the Hill to various White Houses. And finally, David Sanger, who is the White House national security correspondent for the New York Times and has been a member of 3 teams that have earned a Pulitzer Prize for their reporting coverage. David also has roles here at the Belfer Center and at the Kennedy School, and he will bring his perspective in national security and defense issues. And he too is an author of several best-selling books. So 4 good friends of Harvard and the Institute of Politics, 4 astute observers to assess the Biden-Harris first year. So David, I will turn it over to you, and with my thanks to Abby and Dan and Kelly. Thank you.
Well, Mark, thank you very much, and welcome to everybody for this first forum of the new semester. We had been hoping to do this one in the forum itself, but the virus thought otherwise, but we're looking forward to doing that. We are, as Mark suggested, all good friends of Harvard and a couple of Harvard graduates, a couple of Crimson editors as well. I think I first met Abby when she was still an editor at the Crimson, and I dropped by there one night. But we're also all good friends of each other, and so I hope that all becomes evident as we talk today. Just a little bit of news kicking around today. And let me just start briefly with this really remarkable announcement. The formal announcement isn't even coming until tomorrow, that Judge Breyer, the leader of the liberal wing of the Supreme Court, is going to retire, making sure that his replacement is appointed while the Democrats still have control of the Senate. Abby, do you see this one coming? And tell us what you think it means at sort of just the beginning of the Biden second year.
Well, the first thing I'll say is that the fact that we've been talking about this what feels like most of today, but as you noted, it is not official yet. The notifications within the court haven't gone out. Justice Breyer hasn't said anything himself. And that too is very extraordinary, that this news was basically broken by reporters at NBC, I believe, and also confirmed by our Wolf Blitzer shortly after that. I think that is extraordinary because Justice Breyer didn't really want to go anywhere. He really wanted to stay in his job, but the reason he's leaving is because he is clear-eyed, as the pragmatist as he's known to be, that the political situation is not going to allow him to leave really on his own terms if he cares about the ideological balance on the court. I think that this is the new normal is now, I think two big things. One, I think fast confirmation processes, the Amy Coney Barrett process that lasted less than a month. It seems to me that is going to be the goal for this administration for whoever they nominate. And I can't see another president wanting to drag this out unnecessarily. So I feel like we're going to be looking at these very tight confirmation processes. And then secondly, the partisanship of confirmations is probably here to stay. I think it's probably the case that if there is a Senate that is different from the president, the party of the president sitting in the White House, it is unlikely that there will be any movement on a Supreme Court justice. That is really unfortunate and incredible, but I do think that that's where we are. I mean, that being said, we're on the verge of having a lot of young people on the court, so we may not have openings on the Supreme Court for quite some time, but still, I think some real norms. This is sort of the end of well, it's been the end of an era, but it's the end of an era about a few things when it comes to the Supreme Court.
So, Kelly, let me ask you to put this nomination in the perspective of this first year. You've had a year in which progressives have been pretty clear that they're highly disappointed in President Biden's performance. You've had a year in which the White House itself has been frustrated that after some early victories getting through a big financial package and then making their way through with the infrastructure bill, ending that moment where we could all yell, "Is it infrastructure week yet?" That they basically got stalled on Build Back Better. They've been stalled so far on their China bill. They've been stalled on voting rights. And so this is a big moment for the president, it seems to me, as he picks Judge Breyer's replacement, and that the list is short. The president's already said it will be an African-American woman.
I think part of what makes it so extraordinary is when you're looking at that moment of 1 year where so many assessments were being done about the president's performance, about his staff, about really the health of his presidency, where was it going? And we didn't know publicly that this was brewing under the surface. And certainly Justice Breyer knew, and that may have factored into his timing. And for President Biden, so many of the things that have deeply affected his presidency have had elements that are so beyond his control. The course of COVID, the world economy, events beyond his control. Some of the things within his control, how he deals with his own party and so forth. This is one of those moments where a president can have such a lasting impact on American life, on the direction of cultural issues, a legacy moment. And it could not come at a better time in some respects for President Biden, because he has said publicly he wants an African-American woman on the court. Our country has never seen that before. So as African-American voters, according to polling, have lost confidence in the president in substantial numbers, here is a moment where he can choose a woman of color who is distinguished and will be the focus of a lot of national discussion and will have a chance to have a huge impact in the future. That's a big legacy opportunity for President Biden. It also comes just weeks before his State of the Union address, which will be his first formal State of the Union. And so in many respects, while I know we'll get to Ukraine and the difficulties with Russia, we're at a volatile, unstable point in the world. Domestically, after a weary year of exhaustion, This is a chance for progressives and for the president's party to have a moment of maybe more unity than we've seen, and a chance for the president to have something that is very much within his control that he can act on.
You know, Dan, not much has been within his control. And one of the things that has been most out of his control has been the pandemic. You remember that July 4th, there was this big party in the South Lawn of the White House. And in the course of that, the president basically said this is going to be the summer of freedom. It turned out to be the summer of Delta. And what happened after that was another variant that came up. And all of a sudden, there have been calls about the president's competency, whether or not the president is able to get test kits out. There's been questions about whether or not the president has been ahead of or behind on the pandemic response. What's your judgment here? Are we asking for too much of a president in a set of events we've never seen before, or is this a legitimate criticism?
Well, David, we always ask a tremendous amount of presidents, and often we ask more of presidents than they're humanly capable of doing. I mean, it is an office in which people invest hopes and dreams, and it's still a single human being, albeit perhaps the most powerful in the world, but there are limits. And I think one of the things that we've seen as a result of the first year of the Biden administration is we have a better understanding, not simply of the powers of the president, but of the limits of the presidency. And in some ways, I think the pandemic is kind of a metaphor for his first year. He came in at a moment when the country had hope that we were going to be able to put this behind us because we had vaccines that were developed, and give credit where credit is due, developed rapidly under the Trump administration, but they hadn't been distributed, and there seemed to be no particular plan for doing that. The Biden administration came in knowing that this was job one, that they had to deal with the pandemic and they had to do something about it as rapidly as possible. And they ramped up. And for a time, they were quite successful in getting people to get those shots in their arms. But then, as you say, just at the moment where they were hoping to declare, if not full victory, at least, freedom is around the corner, they were slammed by the Delta variant and then, of course, by the Omicron variant. And some things are out of his control. They've tried in every way that they can think of to convince people who have resisted getting a vaccination to get a vaccination. And they've not succeeded very happily in getting that done. They've hit a wall on that, and there's not been much progress on it. That has allowed other variants like the Omicron variant to spread very quickly through the country. And as a result of that, they have come under legitimate criticism for not being prepared for the things that any administration should be prepared for, given what we've gone through the last 2 years, namely readily available tests, a better sense of where we are about these things, and other elements in terms of managing this crisis. The American people are exhausted by this for all kinds of reasons. They're tired of, almost every element of this pandemic, and that falls on the president's shoulders. And I think that that it is one of the things that has made people think differently about President Biden today than they did when they went in. The NBC had a poll that came out over the weekend, and just 5% of the country thinks that Biden has done better than they had expected, and 36% say he's done worse than expected. And frankly, those numbers, both on the good side and the bad side, are worse than all of the previous 3 or 4 presidents that he is being compared with. So the pandemic is in many ways out of his control, but he's the president and people look to him to do what he can.
Abby, if we had told you a year ago, as you were preparing to go off on maternity leave, and congratulations on the baby.
Thank you.
That when you got back to work, the president's poll ratings would be down in near Trump territory.
Yeah.
That you'd seen the numbers that Dan just described, that the Republican Party had sort of forgotten what it said about its shock and horror about January 6th a year ago, and were now lining up behind President Trump, and that Trump had been sort of a lurking presence behind President Biden all through this year. Would you have believed any of that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm so glad you phrased it that way, because truly coming back into the political sphere after being out in the world a little disconnected, it has been really surprising to see what's been going on in the political world, what's been going on in Washington, and also how disconnected in a lot of ways it feels from what's happening out in the rest of the country. And I think that partly explains why Biden is struggling so much. It's because I think a lot of people who are going about their lives are, we've been talking about exhaustion, they are at their wits' end with everything. And they had hoped, the hope was a year ago, that Biden, he promised that he would come in and he would be competent. He would be someone who knew how to govern and could do it without a whole lot of drama, without a whole lot of, fanfare, would get their lives back to normal. And this is the result of a lot of really big promises and people being disappointed that those big promises haven't been fully fulfilled. So on the Biden side, I think that's what, you're really seeing people kind of looking around and taking stock of the last year of their lives and saying, do I feel better off? And many of them are saying no. Now, is that all President Biden's fault? I think a reasonable person would argue no. I mean, this has been a very slippery virus for us to get our arms around. I think the Biden administration has found that, following the science is a lot harder to do when there is not always a public health consensus around what the science says. All of these things have made things more difficult for him. On the other side of things, the Republican Party has completely, frankly, it doesn't really matter what, the denunciations from, Mitch McConnell and others occasionally about Trumpism. The reality is that when you look out at the country and you look at the candidates who are running for office, I just watched today an ad for a candidate running for governor in Pennsylvania, where this candidate is saying that it is a fact that there was so much fraud in the Pennsylvania election that it requires all of these measures to crack down on voting, crack down on mail-in voting, all kinds of things. I mean, this candidate says in the ad that those things are a fact, when those things, as we all know, are not a fact. And so the Republican Party really has not been chastened by what happened on January 6th. They haven't been chastened by Trump losing for them 2 winnable Senate seats and thus handing a Senate majority to the Democrats and handing the presidency effectively to Joe Biden. None of that, I think, really has changed the direction that party is headed in, and that is toward Trumpism, not away from it. So yeah, I mean, things have turned out a little bit differently, and that's, for a lot of different reasons. But I think out in the world there, where people are really grappling with their day-to-day lives, I found that people are maybe less worried about some of the political discussions that we have here about the future of democracy, the future of the parties. They're more worried about their day-to-day lives. And that's the real reason that the Biden administration is struggling. It's because people are finding it very hard to just do things that they thought were normal 2 years ago before this virus came into all of our lives.
Kelly, just picking up on Abby's last point there, when I'm outside of DC, and some days I get as far as in the real world as, say, Cambridge, what I hear the most other than the virus is inflation. It's people pulling up to the pump and paying $4, or going to the supermarket and, not finding very much on the shelves, and what it is seems to be wildly higher. So 2 questions for you. First of all, did President Biden partly bring this on himself because the spending bills and that they pushed through at the beginning part of the year, to the mind of some economists, not all, actually fueled this inflation? And then did he fail to see this coming, even though there were many people, including Larry Summers on the Harvard campus, who were warning this is exactly where we were headed?
I think that there was such an urgent need to try to put out the immediate fire of people who were home, out of work, in urgent need for some financial relief. So things like the direct payment checks, when there were plenty of anecdotal and very real accounts of people who needed that financial support. And so there was a desire to inject money into the economy, kind of like the fire department racing to deal with the fire, and then the political will to do more into the economy. And then what we did see is that people were buying more, and that buying drove the demand. And then we had our supply chain issues. And in the world of politics, unintended consequences are often tied to the political problems that started as a great idea and a noble, worthy, righteous position, and ends up in a mess that people didn't anticipate. And what you find when you talk to real Americans, they know exactly what their grocery bills were, and they know what they are now. They're very in tune with the experiences of what their children are going through in the classroom and how that is different. And that's a picture of life in America that office holders are sometimes disconnected from. And so when the administration and lawmakers were trying to flood the zone of anxiety, worry, and real economic alarm with resources, people didn't anticipate, despite the fact that, as your predicate indicated, there were economists who said, this might be too much, this might be dangerous, and now what to do about it. And so what we hear from the White House consistently is this is a global problem and that this can be dealt with over time. But that is very frustrating to people who are trying to simply get through the normal events of life, and their buying power is not what it was. And you have pockets of real experience too, where we've seen wages for people in the service industries going up, which is something many people have wanted to see for a long time. But again, the buying power has been reduced. So the ability to see around corners has been difficult for this administration, trying to address an immediate fire and not seeing some of the issues that would be around the corner.
And I just wanted to add really quick to all that Kelly just said, which was spot on. The Biden administration, when they were coming in and looking at surveying what they had to deal with, they were worried about the opposite problem that they experienced, some of them during the Obama administration, in which they felt that the economic relief during the Great Recession was too small, and that it gave them a protracted and slow recovery that Democrats paid for at the ballot box, and that Obama was blamed for. And frankly, when Trump ran in 2016, he ran on the quote unquote slow recovery of the Obama years. They wanted to avoid that by going big. And I think under normal circumstances, that might have worked fine, except for supply chain disaster, globally, that is not within their control. And then this labor shortage, which is a result of people not having childcare because their kids are at home, or their daycares are closed, or they're worried about their own health and they don't want to work in a place where they're put at high risk. Those things have made it, that's why those consequences were perhaps unforeseen. at the same time, it was a deliberate choice on this administration's part to say, we have to go big. And as the New York Times put it in a op-ed this past week, they chose to supercharge the economy. The price that they pay for that now is inflation, and they can only hope that that inflation will be short term, and that in the long term, 3.9% unemployment, that's a great number. Wages are going up. They just have to get prices to come back down quickly enough that people don't get very, very frustrated.
So, Dan, what we've heard from both Kelly and Abby is this is something that's going to require some time. Inflation doesn't come down quickly. It didn't. Problem was made over some period of time, but he didn't have a whole lot of time. The midterms are November. That gives 10 months to go get this figure down and bring those numbers back up. And as soon as the midterms are over, people are going to say, is this man running for president again? And can you run for president at age 82? So we turn this question to you because I think you've covered every campaign since 1968. Was that right? You were at that convention?
68 was the first convention I covered. Then I took a long hiatus and I did some economic reporting and other things and got back to it in 1980 and have done them all since. So,
okay, well, that'll count for our purposes. In 1980, I was still kicking around the Harvard campus trying to figure out what classes I was taking. So, so tell us, if you're Biden, what do you think about how you play this between now and midterms? And what do you think about the next 2 years of your administration?
Well, he's got a very tough hand to play. There's no question about it. I mean, just history is not on his side. Presidents in their first term have bad midterm elections, sometimes a small number of seats, sometimes a huge number of seats. So just starting out, he was on the defensive. The fact that his poll numbers have fallen to the point that they have puts him in more trouble. And the fact that neither the pandemic nor the inflation piece of the economy have been dealt with effectively at this point puts him in more trouble. I recall a conversation with an administration official pre-Omicron, and this person basically the strategy was, and I'm oversimplifying, well, things just have to get better, and they will, and so they will get better. The economy will look better in April or May than it does in November, and that the pandemic will look better in April or May or June than it does, in November or December. They've had a bad several months since then on both those fronts, and so as you suggest, the compression of time is staring him right in the face. I had a conversation today with a Republican pollster who, in the course of the conversation, just said, everything he's looking at is that Republicans will have a stellar year. And I said, well, what do you mean by stellar? And he said that they will emerge with a House majority that is comfortable, and that depending on who they end up nominating for some of these Senate seats, if they end up with people who are too Trumpian and therefore not appealing to the mass of the voters, to the general election electorate, if they can avoid that, they can take over the Senate. That will fundamentally change Biden's presidency. Now, we know again from history that doesn't mean he could not win a re-election campaign if he chooses to run in 2024. Bill Clinton had a terrible midterm election in 94 and came back and won fairly easily in 96. President Obama had a terrible midterm also in 2010, and he came back. He had a tough race against Mitt Romney, but he prevailed in that. So it's not the end of the Biden presidency, but it fundamentally changes the Biden presidency. If you have a Republican-controlled Congress, for one, there's no hope of getting anything through that doesn't have a fair amount of Republican support. And so far, we've seen that the Republicans' appetite to cooperate with the Biden administration is quite limited. The only thing they really have cooperated on is essentially a big pork bill in which everybody, every district in the country is going to benefit from it. And so The other is that a House of Representatives that is as rambunctious as this one might be under the Republicans will make life difficult for the administration with oversight and investigations and all manner of things like that. And so it is crucial that the Democrats and the president do everything they can to put themselves in a position to compete effectively in November. But again, it's a tough hill that they're going to have to climb.
That's right. I think that's right.
David, can we flip roles here?
Sure.
And
please.
There's so much on the foreign policy plate, and you are our resident expert on that. So I would like to pose some questions to you and have Kelly and Abby jump in on any of those as they wish. Prior to what happened at midday today, the biggest story that all of us have been paying attention to is Ukraine and Russia and what is going to happen there. My basic question for you is there much chance for diplomacy at this point, or are we, moving inexorably toward some kind of military incursion by the Russians into Ukraine, and what are the consequences of that?
Well, I'd have to say that, as you're right, until we heard about Justice Breyer, I think this was certainly the thing that was foremost on everyone's mind. And I can't stress to you enough the degree to which the Biden administration is really in crisis mode on this. Not only because I think if you sort of polled them and took the average, I think you'd probably say there's sort of a 70% chance that the Russians will take some kind of military action in Ukraine, but also because what this represents, that from the fall of the Berlin Wall through to the decade that followed, we thought we had an understanding of how Europe was ordered, and that Russia would be sort of contained in a box. There was an effort to try to integrate it into Europe, which Putin ultimately rejected. But that we thought we understood what Russia's boundaries were, what NATO's boundaries were, and what the boundaries were of the buffer states that were between NATO and Russia. And what we've seen in the Russian demands is essentially an effort by Putin not only to stop Ukraine from veering to the West, which it's done ever since Russia took over or annexed Crimea in 2014, but also to basically try to begin reconstituting elements of the Soviet Union. Not the whole thing, but I think Putin is believing that if he can get Ukraine, either put in a puppet government or actually physically take over the country. He's already got an ally in Belarus to the north, where he's also massing the troops against Ukraine, Russian troops. And he just went in and saved the leader of Kazakhstan. He could be the Russian leader who begins to assemble back part, not all, of the old Soviet empire. And that's the bigger fear here, that what we're seeing is part of an effort to undo an experiment that for 25 years we thought was bringing a new form of stability and peace to Europe, at the very moment that Joe Biden desperately wants to get the country focused on China, the true competitor. You know, the great line people use is, Russia's the hurricane, China is climate change. And if you don't deal with China and the climate change element of this, which is to say a competitor who was a military and economic and a technological competitor, over the long term, you know, that's what Biden's legacy will be judged on. And all of a sudden, here's Vladimir Putin coming back and saying, you're not going to forget about me. I may not be able to build next generation cars, chips, and batteries, but I can sure ruin your day.
David, let me follow up on that. Bob Gates had a piece in the Financial Times a few days ago, which was a kind of an against the grain piece in some ways. His argument was that Putin has overplayed his hand, and that there will be terrible consequences no matter what happens in terms of whether there is an incursion or not. His argument is that Putin has managed to more or less unite NATO in a way that it had not been united, and given it a purpose that it didn't necessarily have. And that by amassing this many troops on the Ukraine border, he either has to use that, and we know that that would be a bloody conflict, and that the Ukraine military would inflict significant casualties on the Russians, and vice versa, obviously. Or he has to withdraw those troops in what would be a humiliating backdown. Is Gates on the right track on this, or does Putin have the West where he wants the West?
As usual, Bob Gates, who was a former CIA director, former Secretary of Defense for both Bush and Obama, and that's quite a trick, right? Right there. I think he's got it just right. And in that op-ed, he quotes Talleyrand as saying, when you have unsheathed the sword, you can do anything with it except sit on it. and that's the problem right now. I mean, there is a group of people within the State Department and the Pentagon who believe that what Putin is doing right now is just waiting for time, filling it with diplomacy that he doesn't really intend to pursue while the ground freezes so that he can run his tanks across. And there's another group saying, no, he's just going to go see what he can go and get out of this. But the response to Russia went back today. It was delivered by the American ambassador, John Sullivan, in Moscow, drafted by Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State, and I think class of 1984, if I have that right. And I can't imagine from the description of this that Putin's going to look at it and think that any of it is acceptable to him, because he gets none of the things that he was demanding instantly. So it's hard for me to imagine the back down scenario.
Kelly or Abby, do you want to weigh in on any part of what we're talking about on Ukraine, and again with a focus on the Biden White House and the Biden National Security Team and what this is telling us about their strategic sense, their vision, their competence, if you will?
I'm sorry, Kelly. Well, let me just say real quick, to David's earlier question about coming back into the political world from, wherever I was for maternity leave. I was out of this during Afghanistan, and that crisis and watching how that played out, again, from the outside, there are a lot of Americans who don't really care a whole lot about what's going on in foreign policy. They don't pay very close attention to it. But what does break through is a sense of chaos, a sense of feeling like the administration didn't have it under control. And that is casting a shadow over their handling of this crisis with Ukraine and with Putin. It raises the stakes for Biden, because in a lot of ways he has to correct that perception that is out there among Americans as a result of how messy the Afghanistan withdrawal was. And I will say that the sense, though, from a lot of people who are very much more well steeped in these issues than I am, is that the Biden administration did sort of get on this pretty early, pretty aggressively. They are working pretty doggedly to find some path on this. Of course, on Capitol Hill, both Republicans and Democrats, frankly, want the Biden administration to do more proactively as opposed to waiting for Putin to act to decide how they react. They want the sanctions now. They want a more aggressive military positioning so that it deters Putin. But at the same time, I think most people will agree that the Biden administration took this very seriously. And the question now is whether they can de-escalate or deter Or if there is a military incursion, what happens then? I think that's the scary part, is what does it mean for the United States if there is an actual ground war in Ukraine, and how far will this administration be willing to go to defend NATO? I think I'm not so sure that I have a clear sense of that from this administration, and perhaps David or Kelly, you have a better sense of that.
Can I shift now for a minute? We're going to open it up to questions very shortly, but obviously we need to address the issue of China, and I want to start with David and then get Kelly's thoughts on this. David, a simple question. To what extent is the Biden policy a departure from the Trump policy? And to what extent is there no clear policy at all at this point with regard to China?
It's a great question. There are surface comparisons that people make between Trump and Biden. The tariffs that President Trump put on China are still there because you wouldn't lift them unless you were going to get something for it. There are the rhetoric, the technology transfer bars, keeping the export of high-tech equipment, particularly chip-making equipment, out of Chinese hands, trying to restrict the Chinese export of 5G equipment. So far, they have not followed the Trump administration in trying to bar TikTok, recognizing that would lead to an uprising on school campuses across the country. But the fact of the matter is, it really is a much more complex, a more subtle policy, but one that has not been very well articulated, I think, to the American public. And part of that reflects the fact that the only way you can truly compete with China is to build things up at home. And one of the few bipartisan things we have seen happen in Congress has been that when you invoke China's name, you suddenly get an industrial policy bill. It's been through the Senate with Democrats and Republicans through it, that would pump $52 billion into the U.S. semiconductor bids, would provide research and development money for everything from long-range batteries that you would use in cars to artificial intelligence and quantum computing. And I think the core of the Biden administration policy, which is you can't fight the Chinese unless you've got something to offer here, is correct and was not a part of the Trump policy. But they do need to get out and explain it better. They were telling me they expected to have big China speeches early in the year. Well, early in the year has been consumed with being on Zoom calls with European leaders, trying to keep them in line about Vladimir Putin. So I do think, to Abby's point, they learned a lot of lessons from Afghanistan, and they've done a lot better allied coordination on this. They were ahead of the game. They saw the troops moving early before we saw them on our commercial satellite stuff. So they get credit for that. But the fact of the matter is, Ukraine is not a member of NATO. We are not going to send our forces in there. And so if Putin decides he's going to take over the country, he's going to take over the country.
Kelly, briefly, and then we'll go to questions. From your reporting around the White House, how much frustration is there with the fact that they now have to deal with the Russian and Ukraine crisis at a time, as David had suggested early on, that they really want and need to be pivoting toward a more robust approach and a more concentrated approach on what to do about China?
I even think you saw this breaking through publicly when the president was being questioned about why he had not been doing more on voting rights, when he actually talked about how many other things were intervening. And you could also put issues like China in that as a placeholder, that his presidency has been dominated by planned agenda items being overtaken by the emerging crises that he had to deal with. And I think one of the things that'll be interesting to watch also in this Ukraine period is the new Europe in terms of now there's a new chancellor and there's an emerging power sort of struggle. Is Macron the head of Europe now? Is that where the power base is? I think that'll be a larger part of the conversation as well. When it comes to China, we hear the president often talk about the fact he has a personal knowledge and rapport with President Xi. And I think the fact that coronavirus in all of its forms and variants has deprived him of travel. And so he has also not had the world stage moments with Xi that a president in year 2 would have already had. And that would have given a much bigger platform for him to deal with some of those issues, requiring them to be front stage. And he hasn't had that, in part because he hasn't been able to travel to some of those events. And China didn't go to the G7, didn't go to some of the big events.
I think that's a great point, and I'll throw it back to David. A great point that presidencies, the president doesn't have the luxury of ignoring anything. And when it pops up, even if it's not something that they wanted to deal with, they have to deal with it. And that, again, is also kind of a metaphor for the first year. I'm going to turn the moderating back to David for questions from our audience.
Well, thanks, Dan. And your point is right. You don't get to pick your elements. And, of all the things that went into the foreign policy planning for this administration for the first year, the concept that you could have a land war in Europe, I can tell you, was not in the list. So we're going to begin to bring students into this. And I want to start with Robert, a student at the college. Robert, what's your question?
Hello. Thank you all for coming tonight. So my question has to do with the president's current approval ratings. Do you believe that Americans are expecting too much of Biden? Because I feel as if the conservatives in this country are not happy with his performance, but even members of his own party are disagreeing. Some moderates may feel that he's leaning to the progressives in the party, and some progressives claim that the president is not acting progressive enough. Do you think that now, 1 year in, the president has a strategy to try to increase his approval ratings?
Abby?
That's a good question. When I talk to Democrats, many of them don't think that there is a plan within the White House, if I'm being honest with you. And I do think, look, you don't get to choose what voters hold you accountable for as a president, right? So I know many Democrats, including those in the White House, believe that President Biden is being treated unfairly. He's getting poor media coverage, that he's being blamed for things that are really not his fault. But at the end of the day, as we've been discussing, voters are asking themselves, do I feel like I'm better off today than I was before this guy got into office? And for many of them on the Democratic side and on the Republican side, the answer has been no. And for many Democrats, it's a question of the order of priorities that the Biden administration tackled, what they wanted to do when. And all of this is so revisionist history, right? We can all say, maybe instead of infrastructure, he should have done voting rights. Maybe instead of another COVID bill, he should have done whatever. But those were the decisions that they made. And the consequence of that is that people aren't feeling the relief. They aren't feeling like a lot has been accomplished. And as long as that's the case, his approval rating is going to be low. The plan right now, it seems, from the White House is just to keep on keeping on with Build Back Better in some smaller form. But many Democrats that I talk to say it's pretty simple. They need to just win. Period. It doesn't really matter what those wins are. They need to put some wins on the board so that they can have something to point to as Democrats go into a really, really tough midterm cycle.
Well, thanks, Abby. Our next is going to be from Noah, also a student in the college.
Hi, thank you all so much for this conversation tonight. It's so interesting to hear kind of a year in review from experts. So Abby, you mentioned that the big promises that came out of the Biden camp during the campaign and during the beginning of his presidency. And one of the promises that really shone through for me was that he would work across the aisle and be a president for all Americans with this bipartisan undertone. How would you all evaluate whether Biden has acted on that promise, given that he ended up with majorities in the House and the Senate and didn't necessarily need to act on them? And how might his approach to governing change depending on how the midterms go later this year?
Dan?
Well, it's an interesting situation he's gotten himself into. I think that he has disappointed a lot of people on the issue of uniting the country. But the reality is this is a very divided country. I often cite this notion. The Gallup organization does a look at presidential approval and measures how polarizing presidents are. And they do that by subtracting, they take the approval rating that a president has from members of his own party and then subtract out the approval rating from the opposing party. President Trump, perhaps not surprisingly, was the most polarizing president and by that measure. But right now, President Biden is very close to that in terms of being a polarizing president. And before Trump, the most polarizing was Obama, and before Obama, the most polarizing was Bush, and so this has been going on for a while. When a president can be seen in one way as a candidate, but the minute they enter the White House, in the environment we're in, the country polarizes around them, and I think everybody on this panel would agree that it's part of Biden's kind of natural instinct to want to operate across party lines and to work with members of the opposite party. It's the way he remembers life in the Senate from back in the old days, and he would like to, in some way or another, recreate that. He did that on the bipartisan infrastructure bill at times when some of his own members of his own party were getting impatient, and it was basically, let's not wait for the Republicans. But he insisted and was successful on that. And I think that he takes that as a victory. But for the most part, Republicans have very little to no interest in cooperating with him. And so it leaves him in a very precarious position. I mean, put aside the question of whether the progressive wing of the party is unhappy with him. There is a part of the electorate that wants Washington to work, and they expect a president to try to make it work. Biden's going to have a lot of trouble with that. And that, we're at a point now heading into the midterms, we're in an election year, where that becomes increasingly difficult.
Dan, to that point, during the press conference last week, the president talked about cutting up his Build Back Better plan and trying to, bring progressives in. Can he discipline his own party? I mean, seems remarkable that he's been losing on these things, not because of Republican obstructionism, which we expected, but because he just couldn't bring his own party around.
Well, he's tried to do more as president. He's tried to be FDR or LBJ without the majorities that either of those presidents had. He's tried to do more with less than any president that we can. Barack Obama had significant majorities when he came in and still struggled to get things done. So Biden is handicapped by the rules of the Senate. He's handicapped by the fact that they don't have any margin for error in the Senate. So that's the reality that he's got to face. And so the question is, does he, in a sense, capitulate to Joe Manchin and say, okay, Senator Manchin, you write the Build Back Better bill and I'll push it and I'll try to get everybody else to go along with it? He's kind of in that position at this point, and it's a tough spot to be in.
Let's turn to Negelev, I hope I pronounced that right, from the Kennedy School. Negelev, do we have you?
I think Ryan might be next after Noah, David.
I think we've got at Negelev, we've just shown up, and then we'll turn to Ryan right after that.
Hi, can y'all hear me?
Hi. Yes, we can.
Thanks so much for being here. My question was about last week in Biden's speech to the nation. He attributed much of the inflation issue to a lack of adequate competition in a lot of industries that we're seeing. And he talked about taking a more aggressive stance and using the full powers of government or the presidency on domestic and foreign issues. And my question is, how effective do you think that this leadership pivot per se will be in ensuring success, not just in the midterms, but also in the longer term after in the former presidency with Trump, it seemed to really shock people to a great extent.
Fascinating question. Kelly?
Well, there were times with President Trump where he would use the force of his personality, sort of the threat of his ire, to compel businesses or sectors to try to do things. And that would get a lot of attention, and that would get, at times, some cooperation. It could inspire some activity. What we're finding more with the Biden side is they are trying to do things through a more agency and process-driven approach. So, for example, in the meat processing universe, they're saying there are forces within those industries that have had very few companies controlling pricing that has affected how, from the cattle ranch to the grocery store, the pricing for the ground beef people are buying is affected, and that they want to get at that, and they want to use the tools of government and regulation to make things more competitive. And there's work to be done there, and there are ways to look at that. You're going to have critics who say that it is anti-business and it is not overnight, but that's what they're looking at. Are there ways to use the tools of government through regulation, through oversight, through agencies, to try to get some of these long-term problems moving in another way? With President Trump, a lot of times it was force of personality that he would bring to bear. Very different styles. Will it work with President Biden? You may see advances in certain ways. When you were talking about semiconductors and investments to counter China a short time ago, I was in the room with the president when the Intel CEO was talking about a huge investment for semiconductor manufacturing in the Columbus, Ohio area. And although that will take several years, they believe that will be a very tangible way to increase manufacturing, which would give greater control inside the United States for the kinds of products that right now are making it very hard for people to buy used cars. And all of that is an investment with a very long time horizon. It can be very difficult.
The president may not have that long.
Yes, it can be very difficult for a White House. The young man who asked about poll numbers, very hard to change your poll numbers with a 10-year strategy. But those are some of the policy things they're trying to work on to do that, to create changes.
Ryan, you have the last question. We're running down on time, so we're going to ask for a short question and a short answer.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Sanger, and thank you all for coming to the forum tonight. It's been a very productive discussion. My question is for you, Mr. Sanger. When I think of the conflict that's currently brewing in Ukraine, I'm not nearly as concerned about what is going on in Europe, but perhaps what could happen down the road with China and Taiwan. If we don't back up Ukraine, who we don't have a defense pact with, but we provide a lot of support to, I'm concerned that China might see this as a green light to go ahead with Taiwan. What do you think the risk is in that? And how do you think Biden should play his cards so we can mitigate the bloodshed if there is any in the future?
It's a very good question, and it's a concern that a lot of people in Washington have and have given voice to. China is watching how we handle Russia. China is also a player in all of this because they're Russia's last friend here. And they've been very quiet on Ukraine. They haven't told Putin not to do it, but they've also been trying to have their a relationship with the Ukrainians as well. And if he does the invasion, and if the U.S. goes ahead with the kind of crushing sanctions and export controls that is threatened, Russia's only way out would be to get China to basically break those sanctions and trade with them. And the Russians are of two minds about that. On the one hand, they welcome it. And on the other hand, they don't want to seem as if they are vassals of the Chinese state. So it's a difficult issue for them. It's a difficult issue for us because the last thing we want to do is drive our two old Cold War warriors, adversaries, into each other's arms. Well, I thank you all. I want to thank Abby. I want to thank Dan. I want to thank Kelly. I want to thank the forum and Mark and your great team. And we hand it back to you to hear a little bit about what's coming up.
We're going to hand it to Hannah and Carson to give us a view of the future. Over to you.
Hi, everyone. I hope you're having a wonderful evening. I'd like to extend another huge thank you to our incredible guests this evening, Dan Balz, Abby Phillip, David Sanger, and Kelly O'Donnell. This was such a timely and stimulating discussion, and I know we all sincerely appreciate your insight and expertise. My name is Hannah Botterell. I'm a sophomore at the college from Springfield, Missouri, currently living in Cabot House, and I am a social studies concentrator, and this year I am honored to serve as one of the co-chairs of the JFK Junior Forum Committee.
And I'm Carson Curad, the other co-chair of the Forum Committee. I'm a junior from Austin, Texas, currently living in Fortsheimer House, and I'm concentrating in history. I echo Hannah's gratitude for our guests tonight. I really enjoyed this discussion. The two of us are super excited to guide Forum towards its goals of fostering meaningful dialogue and exposing students to thoughtful discussion of the challenges facing our world. To that end, we have a lot of really exciting programming coming here to the Forum in the near future. A week from today, we'll have a forum introducing our Spring 2022 IOP Fellows. And then the week after that, on February 9th, we'll host Ambassador Bill Taylor. During the Arab Spring, he oversaw U.S. assistance and support to Egypt, Tunisia, Libya, and Syria, and he served as the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine from 2006 to 2009. This forum will be moderated by Ambassador Paula Dobriansky, a former Undersecretary of State for Global Affairs, and currently a senior fellow at the Future of Diplomacy Project at the Belfer Center here at the Kennedy School.
Yeah, we are absolutely thrilled for the semester of forums ahead of us and truly hope that you will all join us again soon. As we've just discussed, now is a particularly important inflection point in our country's trajectory, and we as young people have both the obligation and opportunity to get involved in political discourse and action. To all the students watching tonight, please don't forget to fill out the IOP Common App by next Wednesday, February 2nd. The IOP is home to 16 different programs, all of which are fantastic resources and will provide you with the guidance that students need to get involved with politics on campus.
Absolutely. In the coming days and weeks, we'll have so much exciting programming at the IOP. And for a full listing of the upcoming events, please visit the IOP website and follow us on our social media channels. And as always, you can see all of our archived forums at the Institute of Politics YouTube channel. We really look forward to another great year of welcoming you into the forum. Thank you so much, everyone.
Yes, thank you all and have a great night.